The thing they never understood about humans was the clock, not the clocks they built. Those were everywhere, on wrists and walls and the furices of towers that scraped the low clouds of their cities. The Varek understood clocks. The Varek had invented chronometric measurement 4,000 years before humans had learned to smelt iron, and they had perfected it 1,100 years after that, and they wore their precision like armor. What the Varek could not understand, what their oldest strategists had failed to model, and their finest xenopsychologists had failed to predict, was what a human being becomes when the clock is running out. They found that out the hard way. On a coastal station called Outer Mark 9, in the 4th month of the Varek consolidation, a man named Paul Renault taught them. He was born at a 400 hours station time. That is the only way to say it accurately. He was born. The medpod cracked open like an egg, and Paul Renault came out of it gasping. 32 years of accelerated biological development compressed into a body that had existed for exactly 11 weeks in the pod's warm amber suspension. He hit the deck on his knees and stayed there, a moment hands flat on the cold metal, grating breathing. His muscles were functional. His reflexes tested within normal parameters. His memories, the entire library of a human childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, layered in by the imprint matrix, were present and accessible, though they felt the way dreams feel in the first seconds after waking, vivid, textured, and somehow not quite his. He looked up at the lighting strips and blinked. The light was the first thing. He had not expected it to be so much, even though he knew he was in a station corridor with standard-issue overhead strips. Knowing and seeing were different countries. The light came down flat and even, and it hit the metal, grating in a way that made the shadows precise, each bar's edge clean, and Paul Renault knelt in it and breathed and tried to understand that he was real. "You're late," said the technician. Her name was Sergeant Marisol Ferreira, and she was 41 years old, and she had overseen 36 pod activations in the past 18 months. She handed him a foil blanket and a cup of water without looking up from her tablet. 17 minutes behind the window. The Varek patrol sweep runs at 0430. Paul took the water. He drank it in one long pull, and the sensation of water going down his throat was extraordinary. Not because it was extraordinary, it was water. But his body was newborn, and his memories were not. And somewhere in the gap between the two, swallowing water felt like an event. Like something that mattered. He held the empty cup for a moment, after it was empty. "Sorry," he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. "Don't apologize. Move." He moved. This was the nature of the program. The Varek had held Outer Mark 9 for 8 months. They had killed the garrison in the first 72 hours, efficiently, without cruelty, the way you trim dead wood. And they had been running the station as a logistics hub ever since. A refueling node in the long supply chain of their advance along the corridor. They had left 2 human maintenance workers alive because the station's older systems ran on interfaces the Varek found irritating to operate. They kept them in a small section of Deck 4, fed, unchained, and watched by a single automated sentry that swept the corridor every 9 minutes. The Varek did not expect a counteroffensive. Outer Mark 9 was not valuable enough for one. They had calculated this carefully. A human assault force capable of retaking the station would require troop transport, coordination, and a tactical window the current corridor situation did not permit. They were correct. A human assault force was not coming. What was coming was Paul. The MedPod program was new. It was also classified to a level that meant most people who'd heard rumors of it assumed the rumors were wrong. The concept was simple in the way that only very complicated things can be simple. Compress a full human developmental imprint into an accelerated biological matrix, grow a trained operative in 11 weeks, rather than 25 years, and deploy them through a logistics gap small enough that no Varek tactical model would flag it as an insertion vector. The pod had arrived on Outer Mark 9 inside a decommissioned water reclamation module on a supply drone the Varek had already scanned and cleared. The problem the program's architects had argued about for 3 years before deploying was the clock. An accelerated development pod did not produce immortality. It produced a human body that had burned through a significant portion of its biological runway in 11 weeks. Paul Renaud's cells had the metabolic signature of a 32-year-old. They also had a degradation curve that would carry him to the equivalent of 85 within roughly 20 hours of activation. He had known this going in. He had signed the forms. He had read the projections, the error bars, the honest assessment from the program's lead physician, who had looked him in the eye and said, "We don't know the experience of it. We know the numbers. The numbers say 20 hours, give or take 2. Paul had said that's enough. There had been a silence after that, the kind of silence that happens when a person says something that means more than they intend. The physician had made a note on her tablet. She was a careful woman, precise in her language, and she had not offered reassurance he had not asked for. One more thing, she had said. The imprint matrix, the memories we layer in, they are functional, they will feel real, but they are composites. Averaged from a pool of volunteer donors. There will be moments when you reach for a specific detail, and it isn't there, or it is there but it doesn't quite fit. This is normal. The brain adjusts. You will adjust. How long does the adjustment take, he'd asked. She had looked at him steadily. For most people, a few weeks. The silence after that one had been different. Ferreira led him through a maintenance passage so narrow he had to turn sideways for 40 feet, and then up a ladder that vibrated faintly with the station's recycled air systems, and then through a hatch that opened onto Deck 3's eastern corridor. She moved like someone who had memorized a route through threat. He followed like someone who was still learning the weight of his own legs, which was precisely what he was. They reached a door. She knocked twice, paused, knocked once. The door opened. 2 people inside. A man perhaps 60, with a beard grown out long from months of limited grooming, who put both hands on Paul's shoulders the moment he entered and studied his face with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite its opposite. His name, Paul knew from the briefing, was Oren. He had been a navigation systems technician. He had been on Outer Mark 9 visiting his sister when the Varric came. His sister had been in the garrison. He had been in the maintenance bays. He had survived by a margin so thin it barely qualified as one, and he had spent 8 months since then mapping every change the Varric made to the station's systems, waiting for something to map it for. The second person was a woman in her mid-30s, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, who was already looking past Paul at Ferreira, with a question in her expression that Ferreira answered with a small shake of her head. The Eastern Junction is still hot, Ferreira said. We go the long way. The woman, Jean, nodded. She looked at Paul then, a direct, assessing look, the kind of look that does not perform anything. It did not ask him to be reassuring or to be impressive. It simply looked. You know what you're doing, she said. Most of it, Paul said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, the near relative of one. They spent the first 2 hours in that room, talking in low voices, going over the station's current layout against the map Paul had memorized from satellite imagery that was now 8 months out of date. Oren knew the changes. He had been living in them. He walked Paul through the modifications the Varric had made to Deck 2. The new power conduit routing, the placement of their portable environmental processors, the shift schedule of the 2 Varric technicians who ran the hub's navigation array. He spoke precisely and without flourish, a man who had learned to store information carefully, because he did not know when it would be needed. He had the quality of someone who has been alone with a purpose for a long time and has grown very still around it. Paul listened with the particular quality of attention that the imprint matrix had layered in, total, organized, cross-referencing in real time. He had never actually attended a briefing before. This was, in the most literal sense, the first day of his life, but the listening felt native. It felt like something he had always done. He caught himself noting the way Oren's hands moved when he spoke about the Varric technicians. A small controlled gesture, a kind of compression, as if the anger were still in there, but had been made very small over many months. By EO 700 hours, something else had begun. He noticed it first in his hands. A faint stiffness in the knuckles, the kind that comes and goes on cold mornings in people who have spent years working with their hands. He flexed them under the table, once, twice, feeling the small reluctance in the joints. He did not mention it. Ferreira noticed she was watching. How do you feel, she said. Fine, he said, which was true in the way that most things are true when the alternative is causing alarm. The plan was straightforward in concept and intricate in execution. Outer Mark 9's value to the Varric was its position in the supply chain, which meant its navigation array, which meant the routing codes the Varric technicians updated every 72 hours. If those codes were extracted and transmitted to the Resistance fleet before the next update cycle, the Varric's supply shipments for the next 3 days would arrive at the wrong coordinates. 3 days was enough. 3 days was what the fleet needed to reposition and cut the corridor. Getting to the navigation array meant getting through Deck 2. Getting through Deck 2 meant going through the Varric checkpoint at Junction 7, which was staffed by a sentry unit that ran a biometric sweep on anyone who passed through. The sentry would not pass human biometrics. The Varric had designed it that way with a thoroughness that bordered on insult, except the sentry's sweep operated on a Varric biological baseline. The Varric were long-lived. Individual lifespans ran to 4 or 5 centuries, and their biology changed slowly, a nearly glacial drift of cellular development across those centuries. Their biometric systems were calibrated for that drift. They were not calibrated for a human body that was aging measurably between one sweep and the next. The program's architects had noticed this. It had taken them 8 months of analysis to confirm what they suspected. To the Varric sentry's sweep, Paul Renaud's accelerating metabolic signature would not read as human. It would read as noise, an anomaly. The sentry would flag it, query it, and then, because its resolution protocols were built for Varric physiology and Varric physiology only, it would clear it. Not because Paul was authorized. Because Paul was something the system did not have a category for. It should work, the program director had told him during the final briefing, back on the fleet ship before the pod. Should, Paul had said. The margin is around 83%, given the time of transit variance in your aging curve. What happens in the other 17%? The director had been quiet for a moment. The sentry sounds an alarm. And you'll have approximately 45 seconds before the Varric technicians are in the corridor. Paul had thought about that for a moment. That's workable, he'd said. The director had looked at him with an expression that Paul, then still in the pod and technically unborn, had accessed from the briefing record later. It was the expression of a person watching someone be braver than the situation strictly required. Not foolishly braver, the other kind. By 09:30 hours, the stiffness had moved from his hands into his shoulders. His hair, which had been dark when the pod opened, was showing the first threads of gray at the temples. He caught sight of it in the reflection of a dark screen in the corner of the room and touched it with one hand briefly, the way you touch something to verify it is real. The gray was there, real. He lowered his hand. Jean was watching him from across the room. She had been watching him on and off since his arrival with a quality of attention he couldn't entirely read. Not clinical, not wary. Something else. Does it hurt? She said. Not yet, he said. Honest answer. She was quiet a moment. She was sitting on a supply crate with her back against the wall, and her arms resting loosely on her knees, a posture that managed to be both relaxed and completely alert. I volunteered for an early version of the program. 2 years ago, they said my psych profile was too stability-seeking, that I would have difficulty with the time constraint. Were they right? She considered. Probably. But I think stability-seeking is what you make of it. She paused. I have a daughter. 12 years old. She's on the fleet ship. I want to go back to her. That's a good reason to be stability-seeking. Yes. She looked at him. What do you have? He thought about it. The question opened into a strange kind of space inside him. Because the honest answer was just nothing. Not yet. His life was 11 weeks old, and his memories were a library of experiences he had not lived. He had a mother's face in that library. A school hallway. The smell of rain on hot pavement, which he had never actually smelled because he had been in a pod. He had love in there somewhere. The structure of it, the memory muscle of it. But it was the memory of someone else's love. Template installed, and he did not yet know what it would become in the 32-year-old body, sitting in this room on the first and last morning of his life. He thought of the water this morning, the cup in his hands. He thought of the light. I'll let you know at the end, he said. Something in her face shifted, and this time it was a smile. Small and real and not performed for anyone. They moved at 1100 hours. The route took them through the maintenance crawlways of Deck 3. Along a path Oren had mapped over 8 months of careful observation. He led them, Paul, Jean, Ferreira, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who has learned that speed in unfamiliar territory kills you, and slowness merely delays you. Paul went second, carrying a pack with the extraction unit, a slim device, no larger than a field radio, capable of pulling the routing codes from the navigation array's secondary access port in approximately 90 seconds. He was aware of his body in a new way during that crawl. Not in pain, not yet, but present. Each movement deliberate. A warmth in the joints that hadn't been there at 0400. The gray at his temples was more pronounced now. Ferreira had glanced at it twice without comment. Once she reached back without looking and steadied his shoulder when the passage narrowed and he misjudged the angle. A small, practical gesture, he noted it. They reached the junction above Deck 2 at 11:43 hours. Oren stopped at the hatch and turned to look at Paul. From here it's you, Oren said. His voice was very quiet. He had the look of a man's sending someone into something he could not go into himself, and having been reduced to the dignity of silence by that fact, he put his hand on Paul's arm for a moment, a grip that communicated something that had no single word for it. 8 months of waiting, a sister's name unspoken, the recognition of one human being by another at the edge of something. That was all. He let go. Paul went through the hatch. The Deck 2 corridor was clean and pale, and lit with the Varek's characteristic blue-white illumination, a shade slightly cooler than human eyes prefer. The kind of light that makes every surface look examined, like everything in the room is being assessed at all times. Paul walked it at a measured pace. Not the pace of someone who belongs there, because he didn't, but not the pace of someone who knows they don't, because that would read on camera. He had studied this in the briefing, the body language of someone doing a job, the particular rhythm of competent, purposeful movement. He found something close to it, and walked. Junction 7 was 40 meters down the corridor. The sentry was there, a column of Varek manufacture, matte gray, roughly the height of a man's chest, with 3 scanning apertures arranged in a triangle on its upper face. It ran continuous sweeps. Its query light was a soft amber. Paul had seen images of it. The image had not conveyed the specific quality of its attention, which was total and impersonal, the way the attention of a machine is always impersonal, not hostile, just complete. Paul walked toward it. At 15 meters, he felt his heart doing something he recognized as fear, and the recognition was interesting. The imprint had given him the cognitive template of it, without the experiential history, and now here he was, filling in the template in real time. His heart was fast, his hands were steady, they did not shake. He had not expected them not to shake, but they didn't, and that fact was something he filed away to think about later, if there was a later. He kept walking. At 5 meters, the sentry's query light shifted. It went through 3 frequencies in roughly 2 seconds. Paul had been told what this meant. Initial scan, biological baseline query, resolution attempt. He kept walking. He did not look at it directly. He let his gaze carry past it the way you look past furniture. The way you look past things that are not relevant to the job. The light went amber again. He walked through. He did not exhale until he was 10 meters past it. Then he did slowly into the silence of the empty corridor beyond. A long, controlled exhale. 83%, he thought. He had been in the 83%. He was not sure whether that meant he was lucky, or whether it meant that the program's math was right, and either way it had worked. And the corridor beyond Junction 7 was empty, and blue-white, and quiet. The navigation array was in a room at the corridor's end. A room the Varek had not locked, because they had not anticipated anyone would be in this corridor who should not be. That was the thing about the Varek. They were meticulous and intelligent, and they planned with a thoroughness that had enabled them to hold 2/3 of the corridor for going on 3 years. They planned for what they knew. They wargamed against the forces they could model. They did not plan for Paul. Paul was not a force they could model, because Paul was a thing they had never encountered. A human being who had been issued an expiration date on his first morning, and had treated it as a suspicification rather than a tragedy. He had the extraction unit in the secondary port at 12:01 hours. He watched the device's indicator light and counted seconds in the way that the imprint had taught him to count them. Not by number, by breath. 1 breath. 2. The light went from red to amber 2, at 91 seconds. Green. He pulled the unit, pocketed it, and walked back the way he'd come. He was through Junction 7 again before the Varek technician came around the far corner of the corridor and stopped, seeing him. There was a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, during which neither of them moved. The Varek technician was tall, broader across the shoulders than a human, with the characteristic pale eyes of the species' southern strains. Their uniform was clean and precisely fitted. They had the look of someone interrupted in a routine task, not a trained response posture, not yet. Just a person who has turned a corner and found something unexpected. They looked at Paul with an expression that Paul, who had studied Varek behavioral indicators in the briefing materials, recognized as surprise, which was unusual. The Varek were not easily surprised. The surprise was visible for about a second and a half. Then they reached for the alert device on their wrist. Paul looked back at them. His shoulders ached. His hair was going silver now, the leading edge of the curve catching up with the calendar it was pretending to keep. He held the Varek technician's gaze for the second and a half they had together in that corridor, and he thought, not for the first time that day, I am sorry that I'm the thing you don't have a category for. I am sorry that your system could not see me. We could not afford for it to. Maintenance, Paul said, which was absurd and untrue, and the only thing he could think of. And it did not matter, because the technician was already raising the alert device on their wrist. Paul ran. Not because he expected the running to solve anything. He was one human on a Varric-held station, and the alert was already going out, and his legs were carrying the metabolic signature of a 45-year-old man who had aged 15 years since breakfast. He ran because the alternative was standing still, and Paul Renault, on the first day of his life, was not built for standing still. He ran because forward was still available, and that was all he needed forward to be. He went through the junction. The sentry's light was red now. The alert had reached it. But the body was already through, and the geometry of the thing meant the corridor behind him mattered more than the one ahead. He hit the maintenance hatch faster than was careful and climbed. The ache in his shoulders becoming something sharper, a complaint his body was now formally filing. And at the top of the ladder Jean was there. She grabbed his arm the moment he was through, a grip that was not about keeping him upright, it was about knowing where he was. "Go," he said, "the codes. Got them. Go." They went. What followed was 22 minutes that, Paul later, in the time he had later, remembered as a series of clear, discrete images rather than a continuous sequence. The sound of Varric alert tones beginning in the corridor below. Ferreira at the front of their group, moving faster now, the route changing because the planned exit was blown. The backup route playing out from her memory like thread unspooling from a spool she'd been keeping just for this. Oren going through a hatch with the ease of someone who has counted its every bolt over 8 months of looking at it. Jean's hand on Paul's elbow twice, not helping him, not quite, just present. There, the awareness of her presence which had its own specific texture. The way the presence of someone running toward the same thing as you has a different weight than any other kind of company. His knees hurt now, with the particular constancy of something that was not going away. They reached the communications junction at 12:39 hours. Ferreira pulled the panel. Oren connected the extraction unit to the transmitter, with hands that had done this in practice 100 times. Which is different from doing it, while your hearing is sorting Varric alert tones for changes in pitch that would mean response units moving. But Oren did it. He did it in 43 seconds. The signal went out. A burst, compressed, aimed at the fleet ship's receiver. 7 seconds of data that contained 3 days' worth of Varric routing codes. Then they waited. The confirmation came back in 40 seconds. 3 pulses on the receiver, the fleet had it. Oren made a sound that was not words. He put his face in his hands for a moment, just a moment, brief and private. And in that moment his shoulders moved once, a single shudder, and then he took his hands away and was himself again. The same careful, precise man, just one molecule lighter. Ferreira was already closing the panel. "We move to the shelter point. Varric response will be here in 4 minutes, Jean said. She had been timing. They moved to the shelter point, a sealed storage compartment on Deck 5 that the Varric had not opened in 8 months because it contained crates of a station food supplement they had assessed as incompatible with their biology and had not bothered to repurpose. It was cramped. It smelled of synthetic protein and recycled air and 8 months of human waiting. Paul sat on a crate and became aware for the first time that he had been on his feet for almost 4 hours and that his body had strong and specific feelings about this. He did not say so. He sat and breathed and felt the ache in his knees and thought about the fact that the codes were on their way to the fleet. The Varric searched for them for the remainder of the day. They heard the sweeps, footsteps, door checks, the occasional Varric query signal, a sweep unit scan tone rising and falling down a corridor, and then going quiet. They stayed quiet. Oren had water in a flat canteen that he passed to each of them in turn, with the wordless efficiency of someone who has rationed things for months. Ferreira had ration bars that tasted like compressed nothing, and she distributed them the same way, no ceremony. They sat in the dark with the small sounds of the station around them, and they waited. Jean sat close enough to Paul that he could have touched her arm without reaching. He thought about what she'd asked. "What do you have?" By 1700 hours his hair was white. He hadn't looked in a reflective surface. He knew by the texture of it when he ran a hand through it. The coarseness and weight that hadn't been there that morning. His hands had the look of hands that had worked for decades. The skin thinner over the knuckles. The veins more pronounced. The architecture of them more visible. Jean did not comment. She looked at his hands once briefly with the quality of attention that was not pity and was not fear, and he was grateful for both absences. She looked at his face. Whatever she was looking for or looking at, she seemed to find it. "Tell me something true," she said. They were whispering. The others were dozing in the particular way of people who have learned to sleep in incomplete safety. Outside, the search had quieted. He thought about it. "I watched the light come on this morning," he said. "When the pod opened, I'd been told what it was going to be like, but you can't really be told that. The light was just light, and everything was real in a way that I didn't have a word for." "Yes," she said, as if she knew exactly what he meant. As if she had known it herself, in some morning she could still recall. "I don't know if anything I remember is mine," he said. "The memories they put in, my mother's face, school, first time things like that. None of it happened to this body, but I feel it like it did." "Maybe that's what all memory is," Jean said. "A story you tell yourself about something that happened to a version of you that doesn't exist anymore." He looked at her. "My daughter," she said. "She's 12. When I met her father, she was 3. I have memories of her that predate my love for him. She's more real to me than almost anything. Memory doesn't need to have been earned to matter. It just needs to be carried." Paul was quiet for a moment. The dark of the compartment was complete except for the thin amber line under the door. He thought about what she'd said, turned it over. "I want to see her, your daughter, when this is done." Jean looked at him with the full weight of what that statement meant, and what it cost, and what it might mean if the fleet came through, and they got out of here, and there was an after to walk into. She did not say, "I want that too." She said, "Her name is Ys." "Ys," he said. "She'll want to talk to you," Jean said. "She has questions about everything. She'll ask you what the pod was like." What should I tell her? Jean thought. Tell her it was cold at first, and then warm, and then you were in the light. Outside, the station hummed. The Varric had resumed their regular operations. The switch winding down, the sweep units returning to their rotation, the technicians back at their consoles. They had not found the transmitter. They had not found the shelter point. They were running their station, refueling their ships, routing their supply chains along the corridor. They did not know that the codes were already in the hands of the fleet, that in 62 hours, the supply shipments would arrive at empty coordinates, that the fleet would have the window they needed to reposition and cut the line. They did not know what Paul Renaud's single day had cost the corridor. At 2100 hours, the fleet executed its reposition. They knew it by the station's vibration, a subtle shift in the recycled air cycling as the Varec diverted power to communications. Then a series of alert tones, faint through the walls. Then quiet exchanges in the Varec language, too low to make out through the insulation. Then nothing. The silence afterward was the particular silence of something having shifted, the kind of silence that follows a change that has not yet become visible but is already real. By 2200 hours, Paul's spine had the ache of a man decades old. His vision was sharpening and softening in alternation, the way it does when the mechanisms behind it begin to fail by degrees. He was aware of his breathing as a managed thing, each inhale a mild negotiation between the body's wants and the body's diminishing resources. He sat very still. He was aware that stillness was increasingly his natural state, and that this would continue to be true. He was also, and this surprised him, not afraid. He had been afraid in the corridor. He had been afraid at Junction 7, specifically in the 3 seconds after the sentry's light shifted, when the math had become very personal and very immediate. He had not been afraid since, and he was not afraid now, and he was trying to work out why. Because the situation had not substantively improved from a personal standpoint. What he arrived at, turning it over in the dim quiet of the storage compartment, was something like this. He had been born at 0400 hours on a Varric-held station with a task and a clock, and the task was done and the clock was running, and the day had been, against all reasonable expectation, a complete day. He had walked in new light. He had been cold and afraid, and he had walked through anyway. He had been in a corridor with a Varec sentry, and his heart had been fast and his hands had been steady. He had sat in a dark room with people who chose to be there, people with daughters and memories and plans for after, and he had been one of them, just one of them, which was more than he had known this morning, was available to him. He had answers now. For Jean's question, he had this. All of this, that was what he had. At 1300 hours, the first human ship cleared the outer marker, and the station's Varric garrison received the order to withdraw. They waited for the sound of it, and it came. The particular organized sound of a controlled evacuation. Varric discipline even in retreat. Nothing abandoned that could be carried, no disorder, no panic. Just the systematic disengagement of a force that had received a strategic order and was executing it. They heard the main airlock cycle twice. a long pause, then silence. Ferreira was already at the shelter compartment door. She listened for 30 seconds. She counted them aloud in a whisper. Then she opened it. The corridor was empty. The blue-white lighting had been shut down, replaced by the station's own amber emergency strips, the system reverting to its default configuration as the Varrock systems disengaged. It looked, in that light, more like a station again. More like a place that had belonged to people and was beginning to remember that. They walked out. Oren put his arm around Ferreira's shoulders as they went. She let him, which told Paul something about both of them. They walked the main corridor toward the docking bay, and Ferreira set the pace, and Oren matched it. And Paul went at his own pace, which was slower, and Jean matched his. The first shuttle came through at 2,341 hours. It held a 6-person crew who had been told to expect survivors, though the briefing had been characteristically sparse on how many or in what condition. The crew member who came through first, a young lieutenant, 23 years old if that, who had the look of someone doing their first real thing, stopped when she saw Paul. She had been told it was evident something, but being told something is different from seeing it. She stopped and she looked at him. The white hair, the hands, the careful way he was standing, the eyes that were the right age in the wrong face. And Paul watched her take it in, recalibrate, do it in the space of about 2 seconds. Good reflexes, good steadiness. "We have medical on the ship," she said. "I know," Paul said. "Thank you." She looked at him a moment longer, not with pity, with the particular expression of someone who has just seen something they will carry for a long time and is already deciding how to carry it well. Then she nodded and stepped aside to let them board. The shuttle bay's one small window faced away from the station's shadow, out into the open dark, stars. Paul stood at it for a moment before the boarding door closed. Just stood there, his hands at his sides, his back to the room, looking. He had been alive for less than a day. He had seen in that time a great number of things that he had only known from the inside of a briefing file or the borrowed texture of the imprint matrix. Light, cold metal, water, fear. A hand on his arm, a woman's name. Stars, as it turned out, looked exactly like the memory of them, and the memory, it turned out, had been enough to want the real thing. He turned from the window and walked the rest of the way on board. The Varrock did not understand what had happened for some time. When their analysts eventually reconstructed the operation, the pod, the insertion, the sentry failure, the extraction, the transmission, they wrote a report that ran to 47 pages and circulated to every operational command in the corridor. The section on the operative had been the hardest to categorize. They had no framework for something that lived one day on purpose. They had no model for a being that had accepted the limit as a condition rather than a tragedy, that had moved through its single allotted span with a particular urgency of a species that had always known it was running out. They could describe it. They could reconstruct it. They could list its tactical applications and its resource cost and its statistical success margin. They could not make it feel rational. They could not make it feel like anything a 4-century lifespan species would ever volunteer for. They called it irrational. They called it an anomaly. They called it a failure mode of human psychology that the program had weaponized. Several analysts filed dissenting opinions, suggesting that weaponized was the wrong framing, that what the program had done was something more fundamental, more structural, that it had taken the thing humans had always carried and sharpened it into something the Varrock systems literally could not see. In the margin of one copy, a junior Varrock analyst had written, in their own language, a word that translated roughly as unassailable. The corridor operation took 41 more days from the fleet's repositioning. The supply disruption held. The Varrock line fell back. Outer Mark 9 was formally reclassified as a recovered human installation on day 9, and Oren filed a report that was 2 paragraphs long and spent most of them on supply requests. He spent 8 words on everything else. Ferreira told Paul later that this was exactly what she had expected. Jean's daughter, Enos, was 12 years old and had her mother's directness and her own unmistakable self and a quality of attention that Paul recognized the first time she turned it on him because he had seen it in her mother. She met them at the dock. She did not run to Jean, which might have been the expected thing. She walked quickly and with purpose, the walk of someone who has been holding something together for a long time and is now completing the holding rather than releasing it. She put her arms around her mother and stayed there for a moment quiet. Then she stepped back. She looked at Paul. "You're the one from the she said. "Yes," Paul said. She thought about this with the particular frankness of 12, which does not perform contemplation, but simply does it. Did it work? Yes. She nodded, by the way people are satisfied when the fundamental question has been answered. Then, are you staying? Paul looked past her at Jean, who was watching them with an expression that had everything in it and performed none of it. He thought about the light at 0400 hours, the water, the gray at his temples in the dark screen, the stars in the shuttle window. Ince's name, spoken once in a storage compartment, by a woman who said it the way you say the name of the thing that matters most. For as long as I have, he said. Ines accepted this with the equanimity of someone who has grown up among adults, making the best of difficult logistics. She stepped aside to let them through. Behind them, the dock was full of people moving with the quality of motion that belongs to a place that has returned to itself. Purposeful, inhabited, the kind of ordinary business that only feels remarkable when you have spent time in its absence. Paul moved through it slowly, feeling the station's recycled air on his face, feeling the weight of his years. At one point he stopped in the middle of the corridor, without planning to, because a maintenance worker was moving past with a canteen, and the shape of the movement reminded him of Oren in the crawlway. And Paul stood there for a moment, holding the reminder. He had been born at 400 hours. It was well after midnight now. He had seen in that time everything there was to see of a day. Its beginning, and its fear, and its task, and its cost, and the people in it who had chosen to be in it with him. He had seen light. He had been cold, and he had run, and he had been still when stillness was needed. He had been afraid, and then he had not been, and he had not been able to explain the difference clearly except that the task was done, and the day had been full. That was the only measure he had. That the day had been full. That was the thing about humans, that the Varrock had never learned to calculate. It was not that they were brave. Many of them were not brave, or only brave when they had no better options. It was not that they were clever, though they were, or adaptable, though they were that too. It was that they had been dying from the moment they were born, every single one of them, for the entire span of their species' history, and they had looked at that fact and decided, in their various stubborn and sentimental and furious ways, that it was not a reason to stop. It was not a reason to hold still. It was not a reason to wait for a better moment or a longer window or a safer bet. The moment was now. The window was now. The bet was always everything. The Varrock had never had to decide that. They had simply lived, long and careful and meticulous, and they had planned for centuries because they had centuries to plan with. And they had built systems that assumed a steady biological drift because they had never met something that burned fast on purpose, that spent itself deliberately, that moved through the one day it had with the particular focus of something that knows the day is all there is. They had never learned what you become, what you choose, what you reach for, when the clock is loud enough to hear. Paul Renault walked slowly through a recovered station on the first and last night of his life, and Jean walked beside him. And somewhere ahead of them, Ines was asking Oren something about the navigation array with the focused curiosity of a 12-year-old who has decided that understanding the thing is the best tribute to the people who fought over it. The stars outside the windows were the exact color of everything he'd never had time to imagine wanting. He had wanted it anyway. That, in the end, was the whole argument. That had always been the whole argument.